Hey Art Nerds, today I'm going to show you how to use mixed media to make this fantastic fall illustration of a tiny person hiding in a pile of leaves. So to begin, we're going to start with our inked illustration, and I'm going to be inking on Canson mixed media paper that I've run through my printer using sanguine pit pens. So this is the set of 4 pit pens with the fine, the small, the B, and the brush and the medium inside, and we're mostly going to be focusing on the fine and the brush tip. And if you guys don't know, once your pit pen starts to fray, you can remove the brush tip, flip it over, reinsert it, and you have a fresh new brush tip. And these are India ink based, so once they've had a chance to fully dry, you should be able to watercolor over them. For the purposes of this illustration, I allowed them to dry for 24 hours. So you can see on the side of the package, we have all of the sizes written out with an equivalent in millimeters. So if you're used to working with microns or Copic multiliners, this will kind of help you find an equivalent. And something that's really cool about pit pens is that they're available in a really wide range of colors. So if you like to do colored line arts, these could be great for you. And they also correspond with the Faber Castell color system. So if you're looking to color match, your pit pens will match with your Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils. They'll match with Polychromos color pencils. They'll match with the new Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers. So this makes creating art a little bit easier, especially if you enjoy doing mixed media art like I do. So we did a full inking tutorial using the brush pen as well as the technical pen in our Canson watercolor and Faber Castell Albrecht Dürer markers and Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils video, so I'm going to link that in the description below. I have here just a short inking clip to inspire you guys. I used the fine tech pen to ink the little face, and I'm using the brush tech pen to ink the majority of the lines. This is going to give me variable lightweight. And you guys can see that sanguine is a beautiful color. It's perfect for most skin tones, or for inking most skin tones, I should say. And then once I've finished inking the exteriors, I'm going to go back in with a fine tip technical pen, a fine tip brush, fine tip pit pen, and ink the veins on the insides of the leaves. Once I have most of the major outlines inked, I'm going back in and adding a little bit of a darker line weight to create the illusion of shadow. And then I'm going to go in with this finer tipped technical tip point and ink the veins on these leaves. So when I say technical pens, what I really mean are fixed width pens that have a metal sleeve to protect the little felt nib inside. So I may use that term frequently. I apologize if that causes any confusion. Alright, so I'm going to let this cure for 24 hours and then we can begin our mixed media illustration. And you guys can still see the blue lines underneath. Don't worry, I have a technique that's coming up in a minute that'll help you remove them. So for this technique, you're going to need a brush and a cup of clean water, as well as a roll of paper towels. And all we're doing is we're applying a wash of clean watercolor using a watercolor mop, giving it a chance to soak in for a moment. That's going to reactivate our dye-based inks. And then we're going to roll our paper towels on top to pick up that ink. And that's basically going to remove all of the ink. Now, if you're using a pigment-based printer ink, it's not going to be as prone to lifting and removal. And if you're using toner, it won't remove at all. So your mileage may vary with this technique. All right, so I'm going to let this dry, then we're going to get to painting. And for today's technique, we're using the new Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, we're using Polychromos, and we're using Pitt pens. So to begin, I want to do the fall colors on the leaves, so I've selected my most seasonally appropriate colors. But first, I'm going to apply a shadow color, a shadow layer of ultramarine blue, and that's going to kind of tone our leaves so we don't have to worry about painting shadow colors on top of the leaves after. And I apologize for the Bowie yodeling. So all I did was I applied some of the ultramarine marker to my non-porous craft mat, added a healthy amount of water, a generous amount of water, and now I'm applying my shadows. He has so many words. He doesn't like it when I record. He gets jealous. Now I'm going to allow this layer to dry fully, and then we're going to begin adding actual color to our leaves. So for this tutorial, I'm going to directly apply the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers to my illustration, and I am starting with May Green number 170. And just like with the Pitt pens, these are part of the color family, so you should be able to color match these with other Faber Castell products. I'm adding some dark chrome yellow, number 109, to the top because I want sort of a mottled olive green leaf. Now I'm washing that out with some clean water to get the colors to blend. Now these markers are really pigmented. When you apply these markers, they're basically applying the most saturated version of that watercolor directly to your paper. So you may want to blend them out. Now I'm applying that same dark chrome yellow to another leaf, and then I'm blending in orange glaze number 113. So for my fall foliage, I selected May Green, I selected dark chrome yellow, I selected orange glaze, I selected pale geranium lake, and I selected dark sepia as the colors that I wanted to use. And speaking of, I went from our orange glaze to pale geranium lake, and I'm blending this out again using water. And I'm going to use a similar technique for all of these leaves, just kind of varying which colors I use. And I have a limited palette of 5 colors that I'm using for fall leaves. So this time I'm starting with orange glaze, number 113. I believe I blended that out with just a little bit of the dark chrome yellow, and then I went in with the dark sepia. And after dark sepia, I went in with pale geranium lake. And once you apply water, and these have had a chance to dry, they do dry a little bit lighter than the direct application. Some of the pigments get moved around, some of them get lifted. So this is a great way to not only fill the area, make sure you don't have any streaking on your paper, but also to lighten the color, so if you wanted to, you could apply subsequent layers. This is also going to kind of fix the pigments into the paper. If we were to just do a direct application like we're doing here with dark sepia, number 175, and we were to then to rest our hand on the paper, our hand would pick up some of that color and it might transport it to other parts of the paper. All right, so now I am blending out our dark sepia again with some clean water. And fall leaves are a vibrant and festive thing that you can illustrate in the fall. That they're very simple, fairly easy. You can find reference anywhere outside, or you can Google reference if you have a preference and if you're looking for a little bit of inspiration. So I colored this leaf with orange glaze. And what I'm trying to do for this illustration is I'm trying to showcase how bright the colors are, how vibrant the colors are, and how easily they mix with one another. Faber Castell sent me this 10-piece set of Albrecht Dürer markers to help me prepare for Hands-On Creativity, which is a 2-day art supply event here in Nashville. I'm going to be demonstrating some of their products along with some Strathmore products, and they sent me these markers to help me prepare. So now I'm applying dark chrome yellow as well as our dark sepia. And again, I'm going to use water to help me blend those colors, help me to get those colors smooth. I have to say, the mixed media artboard is an ideal surface for this because it dries quickly, but it handles the water quite well. It handles the water better, I would say, than the watercolor artboard that I used in one of my previous tutorials. So now we're using May Green, number 170, with a little bit of our dark chrome yellow. And I'm not worried about polluting my tips. If you're worried about that, you can always scrub them out on a piece of paper to remove that excess pigment. And you can see some of my leaves have already started to dry. I really love that green and yellow leaf in the foreground. Then we're going in again with pale geranium lake, and this is a really, really strong color. This and the dark sepia are very intense and can have a tendency to overwhelm some of the other colors you apply. So something that I also really like about the combination of this paper and these markers, and I'm blending that out with orange glaze number 113, is that the brush tips on these markers are not particularly abrasive. They're fairly soft. They're not flexible brush tips. They're not flexible like Ecoline markers would be, or like Prismacolor markers are, or Copic markers are. They're a little bit stiffer. They're fiber brush tips, but they're great for laying down large areas of color. And I didn't notice any paper abrasion, and I didn't notice any really detrimental effects to my brushes. So I just filled that leaf with dark chrome yellow, number 109. And I'm just washing the whole thing out. And you guys noticed I left a little bit of a halo of white. This helps us achieve some color shading. We can see more gradation in the color. Now I'm applying orange glaze, number 113, and I'm blending that in with pale geranium lake. Next, we're going to use a little bit of dark sepia. So this paper truly is a mixed media paper because we're using watercolor markers on it. We're using watercolor techniques on it. Later, after it's had a chance to dry, I'm going to use color pencils on it and even pip pens on it. And that's what I really like to see in a mixed media paper, is a paper that's sturdy enough to handle whatever I throw at it. So next, we're using dark chrome yellow. And in the near future, I really want to test out alcohol markers on these papers when I have a little bit more time. And then May green. I think probably by now you guys get the gist of how I'm applying these markers, what kind of color combinations I'm using, and how I'm blending my colors. And I just really enjoy the mottled blends for these leaves. They really do look like fall leaves that you would find outside. So I'm not going to do a whole lot to them after this point, but you guys will see that in a moment. So I've been using these Albrecht Dürer markers pretty consistently since I'm preparing for hands-on creativity, and I already feel like I like them better than the Winsor & Newton watercolor markers. I was so hyped for the Winsor & Newton watercolor markers years ago, but their pigment flow just doesn't quite keep up with the pace that I need. And the Faber Castell markers seem to be a little bit better made. Like the plastic for these, it feels like toy grade plastic, so it's like a sturdier plastic. It's color coordinated, so it's easier for me to find the colors that I need. It belongs to a larger color family, so it's easier for me to color match. And the ink flow, the pigment flow can keep up with my painting. As I mentioned in my other Albrecht Dürer watercolor video, my only regret is I wish these were pump action. I wish the bullet nib was a pump action nib, and I wish these were refillable. That would just be like the perfect icing on my cake. But these are still new, so there's still time for innovation, and I'm kind of hoping that is something Faber Castell will either think about or perhaps be able to explain to me why, and that way I can like come to peace with the notion. Now, again, like I mentioned in the other watercolor video, there are pump action watercolor markers on the market, but those are dye-based, and I'd really love to see a pigment-based watercolor marker that utilizes a pump action. So the only thing I'd really caution you guys with these are fairly small fall leaves. I would just say don't use too many colors. Don't try to get too detailed if you're doing this technique. Keep it simple, 3 colors max, because it's going to get muddy if you do too many colors. And I recommend experimenting. As I was laying out these leaves and deciding which would be what colors, I tried to avoid repeating the same colors next to each other, which definitely makes for a color cacophony and is not strong storytelling, but I'm doing this illustration to showcase the product and how vibrant these markers can be. So I think handling the illustration this way was an excellent choice. Now, as I'm coloring these, I'm starting to kind of feel like the sanguine wasn't the best choice. But fear not, I've got a solution for that coming up later in the video. So we've got our leaves mostly colored in. Now we just need to worry about coloring our sticks and our acorns. I applied a light wash of orange glaze to the acorns just to kind of influence the color, since some acorns have sort of a warmer brown. And for the sticks, I'm going in directly with dark sepia. And as you guys can see, I should have left more white highlights on these because that dark sepia gets really intense. Now I do leave more white highlights with the acorns, and that gives me room to blend out. It gives the color kind of room to breathe. You guys can see I even blended down from the cap to apply my color as a lighter wash to the body of the acorn. So once I finished coloring in my leaves, I start using pit pens. And for this part with the pit pens, I'm actually applying them to the craft mat and then handling them like watercolor. And Bowie's gonna complain because I'm gonna need to move him. So since we're dealing with more colors in this instance, I'm not gonna tell you guys exactly what colors I used for this, since I want you guys to swatch and find your own solutions. But I used a really light skin tone and applied it directly to my craft mat and then painted that in on our skin. And then as that dried, I went in with the pit pen. So the cool thing about pit pens is they are going to be indelible to water once they fully dried, but you can treat them like watercolor before they fully dried. So they're very flexible India ink medium. And I have another tutorial coming up where I use pit pens to do an entire illustration. So I hope you guys are looking forward to watching that one. I'm really excited about that video as well. So I'm just using kind of a warmer pink to add some blush to her lips and her cheeks. And I do apologize that you guys can't see more clearly. I probably should have zoomed in at this point, but I did want you guys to be able to see the hole and how I handle the hole. And then I'm using a little bit of yellow and terracotta to start painting her hair. I don't paint a lot of blondes, just for a lot of different reasons. So I decided to render her as a blonde for this illustration. So now I'm using kind of a blotter sheet to protect my illustration from my hand so I can go in and do tighter details with the pit pens directly. And then when that has a chance to dry, I go in with the Polychromos color pencils. So I haven't had a chance to really talk about these yet, but the Polychromos color pencils are some of the butteriest, softest color pencils I've had the pleasure of using. They are fairly snap resistant, which is so refreshing if you're coming from like Prismacolor. These are like night and day. And they have a really thick core, so they're good for larger areas of color. I would even like to see some jumbo Polychromos, the way we have jumbo Albrecht Dürer color pencils for large areas of color. So I've mentioned in some of my other videos that I'm not really a color pencil person. I find the repetitive motion to be really taxing on my hand, but I do like using color pencils to add details, and that's what I'm doing on the leaves here. I'm using the Polychromos on top of the dried Albrecht Dürer watercolor marker, so this has had a chance to dry fully. I'm using them on top of the dry Albrecht Dürer just to kind of unify some of the colors, refine some of the colors, add some highlights, tie things together a little bit. And a little bit later on, I'm going to be using them to add a unifying shadow layer as well. So I'm just kind of picking through with yellows, oranges, greens, and maybe some browns to just kind of refine and tighten up my colors. And at this point, how much you refine your illustration is really up to you and your taste level. I'm trying to keep it fairly loose. So something I didn't mention is that at one point I took a spray bottle and I sprayed my leaves, and I did that to just kind of loosen up the colors, to get them to move a little bit, and to kind of model the leaves a little bit more. And spraying them with water kind of reactivated the pigments in the Albert Dürer markers, not quite as much as I wanted. I wanted a lot of movement. I should have done it immediately when it was still wet, but I felt like it had gotten too tight and too controlled, and I wanted to loosen it up just a little bit. And doing the spray water technique is kind of a cheap way to loosen up my watercolors. So I'm going in with a Helio Blue Reddish, just to add some shading to my leaves. My only real complaint about the Polychromos, and it's the Polychromos 24 set, and you can pick up colors open stock, is I wish it came with a darker blue-green. The phthalo blue in there is kind of a teal phthalo. And I love using darker blue-greens when I'm rendering foliage, or an indigo would have been really useful. So a cool dark blue would have been really useful in this set. So instead I'm using a warm blue, which is actually better because almost all the colors in this illustration are warmer anyway. So that lack of having my go-to comfort color actually forced me to choose the better color for it. So it did work out. And you guys can see I'm just using this to kind of color in some shadows and to kind of help give more depth to the piece. I didn't want to do this with the Albert Dürer markers because the colors were so saturated, and I wanted something that was a little bit more subtle. So at this point, I really felt like the sanguine line art isn't suiting the piece, so I'm re-inking the shadow parts of the line art using the walnut brush pin, the Pit Pen brush pin in walnut color. And I'm really just kind of inking in those loops in the leaves just to give a little bit more depth and shadow, and I actually really like how the line art looks after I finish doing this. It added good depth and dimension. And that about wraps it up. So if you want to do mixed media with Faber Castell products, I recommend you begin with your watercolor explorations first, and then work towards your dry media. And if you need to re-ink, re-ink at the end. So I inked at the beginning, and then I removed my dye-based blue lines. I used the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers to establish our beautiful fall foliage. I love how these turned out. Now I'm going in with a white Polychromos just to add in some more white highlights and get it to pop a little bit. Another way you could do this is just leave the white of the paper still visible, or apply some masking fluid to protect certain areas. For me, I just prefer to go in after. I know it is not like true watercolor technique, but I'm a watercolor comic artist. I do what I want. After I used the Albrecht Dürer color pencils, the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, I went in with pit pins and applied a watercolor treatment to the girl's face, and then added details with straight up pit pin brush pins as necessary. Then I went in with the Polychromos color pencils and re-inked with the pit pin brush pin in walnut, and then added white highlights using a white Albrecht Dürer color pencil. Thank you guys so much. I hope you guys found this video helpful, useful, and informative, and a huge thank you to Faber Castell for sending